Well, hello, my friends. We're coming up on the midday-ish, mid to afternoonish time, at least Central and United North America, South America time zones. But for the rest of you who are on all over the world time zones, thanks for kicking and staying with us for another live session. I just wanted to show you all. So excuse the attire, but I put in my 5K today for the 5K challenge, the virtual RubyConf 5K challenge. So if you haven't seen it, check the Slacks. It's there. I encourage you to get going if you haven't. It's not a 5K. You can also do 30 minutes. Anyway, enough of that. Let's just dive right in. So our next speaker is Jesse. So I want to welcome him to the stage. Jesse. Hello, hello.
Hello.
All right. Okay. So Jesse's going to kick it off, helping end, kind of close out the final sequence of events for day 2. Jesse, the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So, hello, RubyConf. I wanted to just start by giving a huge thank you to the RubyConf planning team. So Abby and Marty were like the primary contact people for me, but I know that there's just a ton of folks who read proposals and put this conference together. So a big thank you to them, and a big thank you to our sponsors. And my biggest thanks of all are to the folks who are tuning in right now. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much. And this conference is really, it's just such a treat right now in the midst of some very uncertain times in the United States and across the globe. And I'm just so grateful to be here with all of you. So my name is Jesse Spevack. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a staff engineer at Ibotta. We're a cashback for shopping app. And Ibotta has a great engineering culture. We get to use some of the most cutting edge tools in the business. The work is super interesting, both because the domain is pretty complicated and also the scale is pretty big. And most importantly, the team is filled with great people who have like really high expectations for themselves. And so, yeah, I definitely highly recommend it if you're looking for your next thing. So personally, I took a non-traditional path to get into software. I worked for 11 years in the K-12 education space. And so I came to software by way of a coding school in Denver called the Turing School for Software and Design. And if you have friends or family who are thinking about a second career, and we've got this great channel in Slack right now for all the second career folks who are at RubyConf, you should definitely send them to Turing, have them check that out. I think it's an amazing program, and it's been really good for me. So let's get started. So today I want to first talk about how interviewing is broken for the job seeker. Next, I want to talk about how interviewing is broken for the interviewer. I will use stories from my own experience interviewing hundreds of candidates and also being interviewed myself a few times. And I want to try to paint a picture of sort of the current state of interviewing. And then I'll share how I worked with my team at Ibotta to reimagine our interview process and draw on the lessons that really I've learned in this community, in the Ruby community. So finally, I'll share some strategies that you can use to reshape hiring at your own companies, whether you're the CTO or a junior developer just starting out. So there's sort of like been kind of a history of people who talk about interviews in this community. And I just want to shout out a major inspiration for me, which is Eric Weinstein's RailsConf 2019 talk, Interview Them Where They Are. It completely jolted me out of my own complacent acceptance of the current state of interviewing. And I hope that this talk will have a similar effect on some of you out there. So let's get going. I want to start out by talking about how interviewing, I want to start out by talking about my own interview experience from almost 4 years ago, because I think it is pretty illustrative of typical interviews at that time, and to some extent today as well. So perhaps this will remind you of your last interview process, or maybe it closely resembles the process at your current company. So the first step was a phone call with human resources. And the purpose of this phone call, I presume, was to make sure that I didn't sound too much like a crazy person, and that my salary expectations were in line with what the company was going to offer. So right out of the gate, this process is very broken. And we're going to go on a small tangent, so just bear with me. Corporate America systematically shares salary information by way of consulting groups that collect and sell this data in a way that the workers of America do not. So nearly every HR team has paid for access to this data. And even if they do not have access to that data, they have had far more salary conversations than the typical developer. And so therefore, the interviewee is always at a disadvantage at this point of the interview in terms of just the asymmetrical understanding of developer compensation. So let's kind of pause and consider how this asymmetry can be felt more acutely by some groups than others. So if you're a white dude like me, you are statistically making 5.4% more than your female colleagues in the same developer roles with the same level of experience, according to Glassdoor's Progress on the Gender Pay Gap 2019 report. Hired Inc.'s wage inequality report shows that similar gaps when comparing the workforce along racial and sexual identities. So a black male colleague is paid 91 cents for every dollar a white male is paid, and male LGBTQ colleagues tend to make 96 cents on the dollar, and it's even worse for female LGBTQ colleagues, 92 cents on the dollar. And this is obviously not exhaustive. But clearly the takeaway here is that salary transparency is very important if we want to end wage discrimination. And we need to pressure our employers to stop trying to save money off the ripple effects of systemic racism and sexism. And we should stop writing job descriptions. Like concretely, we should stop writing job descriptions that say, competitive pay, and start actually listing compensation numbers. So returning to my own hiring process, after my phone screen, I had an interview with the engineering manager whose team I was applying to join. And the purpose of this conversation was first to give the manager a chance to gauge my potential value to the team. And second, to get me excited about working at Ibotta, that I'd be willing to sort of persevere through the gauntlet that they were about to put me through. So after the interview, I was given a take-home project to build a set of APIs that could perform various CRUD operations on words and their anagrams. A lot has been said about take-home projects in this community. And DHH wrote a blog post where he said, "I've heard many fair complaints that companies are asking candidates to complete massive projects that may take 20, 30, 40 hours of work, which is all unpaid, and which might be difficult for the candidate to fit in with their existing job and life. Yeah, don't do that." So for me, I spent 16 hours on the Anagram API project, implementing all the bonus endpoints, writing unit and integration tests, and putting together a comprehensive README file. I remember finishing the project and saying to my wife, "This is the best project I've ever done." A few days after submitting the project, I was invited to do a remote project feedback session, and I was just so excited to hear how great the 16 hours of work I put into my Anagram API was. And I was sure that the 2 days of my wife single-handedly caring for our, at the time, 1-year-old twins while I coded in our bedroom was not going to be for naught. So during the feedback session, I walked through the code with 2 engineers at Ibotta. And as someone who basically had no professional coding experience at the time, I actually assumed that these engineers' jobs were just to give feedback on code that was written at Ibotta. And let me tell you, they gave me quite a bit of feedback. So they said things like, "I think your median calculation is not right. Can you explain why you're calling flat in there? Why did you choose not to optimize that query?" Which I thought I did optimize. These are just a few of the highlights from the conversation. It was brutal. I came out of the bedroom dripping sweat, totally dejected. And I told my wife that I was not going to get the job at Ibotta. It was brutal. So let's like summarize all the ways that this take-home project phase is completely broken. So first, Ibotta is not an anagrams business. It's a cashback for shopping app. And in retrospect, knowing that knowing what the past 3.5 years of work has been like for me at Ibotta, I can say there's basically no overlap between the code that I wrote to serve anagrams and the code that I write to reward shoppers for their purchases. So next, the project took me 16 hours, for which I was paid $0. I was desperate to get my foot in the door, so I did it. And many other folks would not or could not do this project given their home life constraints. So probably the hardest part of the whole thing was just the childcare that my wife provided. If I was a single parent, this would have been completely undoable. Finally, after the feedback session, I was left with the impression that I was not smart enough to work at Ibotta. But to my surprise, I was called in for a half-day in-person interview. I entered a room with 3 engineers waiting for me, and I was asked a few questions about my background, and then I was pointed to a whiteboard on the wall where I had to write a function that takes in an array where each element is either an integer or a similar array and outputs the sum of all those integers. This problem you can solve by writing a recursive function. And after I went through that, I was asked to model the game of chess on the whiteboard. After that, I was given the opportunity to ask the interviewers a few questions about Ibotta. And then a totally new set of engineers came in and repeated that process exactly. So this time I had to write a function to reduce overlapping ranges on a number line. And this question has a trick, which of course I did not know. And the trick is that if you start out by sorting these lists of the list of ranges in order of either their minimum or maximum point, the algorithm for combining the overlapping ranges becomes way simpler. So let's like think through the problems with this process, right? So first of all, right out of the gate, I was asked to write a recursive function in front of an audience. And I can tell you that the Ibotta code base is quite large, and the only recursive function I've ever seen in its many hundreds or maybe even thousands of files, I actually removed a year ago because it was confusing. And second, not everyone likes chess as much as I do. Third, the range reduced sorting trick is really just a trick. And if you read like Cracking the Coding interview or very close to some computer science coursework, you likely know this trick. I'm not confident at all that there's a causal relationship between knowing these kinds of tricks and being a productive member of a software development team. Finally, and I haven't said this explicitly yet, but the only non-white male I spoke to throughout my entire interview was Kayla from HR. So let's generalize my experience a bit. First, I had a time-consuming unpaid project. Second, I was made to feel that I had done poorly on this project and would therefore not be a successful employee. Third, I was asked to perform at a whiteboard on problems that were not particularly representative of the work that I was interviewing to do. And most importantly, I had it easy. People make all sorts of assumptions about me based on how I look and speak. And typically, especially in the software world, these assumptions work in my favor. If I was not a white dude, statistically, I'd be doing all of this for the opportunity to earn less money to boot. So in summary, and this is really what I want to run home with, this process is just not nice. So next I want to kind of turn to how this process is broken from the interviewer's perspective, right? I think a lot of, looking at the chat, I think a lot of us agree the interview process is broken for the person looking for the job, but I'm going to now present my case of why this is a terrible process for the interviewer also. And so over the last 4 years, I've led maybe conservatively like 200 technical interviews that go through the process basically as I've just described. And the purpose of these interviews from the interviewer's perspective is to collect data to make a guess at the potential value that the candidate is going to bring to the team. So an effective process, if this was a good process, right, the interviewer would leave with a lot of data that makes estimating that potential value very, very accurate or very easy. So at Ibotta, we use a 4-point scale of strong no, no, yes, and strong yes. So I want to show you like roughly how that plays out in my history of interviewing. So I've given only one or two strong no's over those 200 interviews. And now in those cases, the applicant didn't get the job, so I can't really like use the experience of working alongside that person to determine like the accuracy of that prediction. So I've also given fewer than 10 strong yeses out of those 200 interviews. And in those cases, the applicants did go on to get the job, but only some of them accepted the offer. So now out of the strong yeses that I've had the experience of working with, which is like some number between 1 and 10, I can say that I was definitely wrong one time. So one strong yes was wrong, which tells me that like roughly 10 to 20% of my strong yes predictions are not accurate. So what's left now is the vast majority of interviews that I've done where I haven't felt strongly confident in the data that I've collected and hedge by only saying either yes or no, as opposed to strong yes or strong no. So here's where the data quality of this interview process can really lead to some mistakes. So in some cases, I did go on to work with folks I said no to and was pleasantly surprised, right, by the value that the person brought to the team. They're amazing. I can't imagine like not working with them. In other cases, I did go on to work with folks I said yes to and sort of had the opposite experience. So it could be that like I have terrible judgment and that someone better at reading people, asking questions, and listening would have fewer misses on the interview process I just described. But I actually think I have like average to slightly above average judgment. And so therefore, I think the problem really is one of data quality. The process does not provide the interviewer with sufficient quality data to empower the interviewer to make an accurate decision with a high degree of confidence. So to see why this might be the case, let's just look back at that process one more time. We've asked our candidate to complete a take-home project with very little in common with the actual job. Then, after they've survived our brutal feedback on their work that we did not compensate them for, we make them answer questions on a whiteboard. These are questions that we already know the answer to and are very dissimilar from the work we will ask them to do when they join our team. So again, this process just isn't nice. So we have a saying in the Ruby community, and it's actually our unofficial motto. Maybe some of you know it. The slogan goes something like this: Matz, the creator of this wonderful programming language who gave the opening keynote, Yukihiro Matsumoto, or Matz for short, right? Matz is nice, and so we are nice. So over time, I'm guessing you can get the full story from someone else at this conference who's sort of been active in the community a little bit longer than I have. But this saying got shortened down into Minaswan. So Matz is nice, and so we are nice. What if the way that we interviewed was nice, right? After all, Matz is nice, and so we are nice. So enter the Minaswan interview. So I want to dive into the components of our Minaswan interview, but I want to first point out that the Minaswan interview is more of is a mindset, right? It's not a strict process to adhere to. It's the idea that, and this is a big idea, right? If we are nice to each other, everyone benefits. And so I'll describe our interview, but I'm not arguing that everybody go out and adopt this exact format. As I describe our new process, I'll try to point out the parts that I think evidence our Minaswan approach, and I'll also describe some areas of improvement, areas where we can be nicer, right? So our Minaswan interview is much shorter than the process I went through. So all other things being equal, this alone is a win for the candidate and for the team, right? Even if our data is just as unreliable, at least we're spending less time collecting it. We still have the phone screen and the manager interview, but we ditch the take-home project completely. After the manager gives the thumbs up, we schedule a 90-minute technical interview with 2 Ibotta engineers, and this interview has 4 parts. So in part 1, we introduce ourselves. We give an overview of the interview and let the candidate introduce themselves. So the goal here is really just to put the candidate at ease, right? Matz is nice, and so we are nice. Some candidates are relieved when we go over the structure of the interview, like knowing what they're going to do, like takes a lot of stress off of them. Matz is nice, and so we are nice, right? Some are calmed by like our personal bios when they realize that like we're real people who have a lot of things in common with them. I also try to say things like, we've read over your resume and it looks like you have a ton of experience that will be great for our team. And I'm never just saying that. Like the entire interview is meant to be framed as we're going to be working together, and let's imagine this is your first day on the team. We're assuming the success of the interview. So in part 2 of our technical interview, we asked the candidate to read some code that we've written. We call this our code composition module. We specifically say, imagine this is your first day on our team, and this is the domain of the code we want you to work on. So we explain that as you look at this code, we want you to tell us like at a high level what it does, what you like about it, and what you dislike about it. We don't actually give them code from our code base. After all, we want them to want to work with us. But really, like the production code is just way too complicated. There's just too much context that for us to be able to fit into like a 20 or 30-minute conversation. So we pick one interesting part of our system. We put together a few Ruby files and some tests, and we send these files to the candidate and ask them to open them up in whatever text editor or IDE they feel comfortable using. And again, Matz is nice, and so we are nice, right? Oftentimes, we interview folks who have not written Ruby before. So when they open up our Ibotta app and see a bunch of .rb files, they get nervous. So we explain that not only can they use Google as if this was really their first day on the job, but they're welcome to ask us any questions that they have about the code. So to further drive home this point, we might say something like, you, like most developers at Ibotta when they start, do not have much Ruby experience. But on day one, you have to pick up stories that require you to start writing some Ruby. So we're deliberately using words that presume the candidate will be successful. When you join our team, you will start writing Ruby, right? This language puts the candidate at ease and allows them to really demonstrate their strengths. So another piece of language that we typically throw in is that the exercise is not meant to be a bug hunt. Developers, like we're conditioned to assume that we're about to be tricked or that there's a gotcha in the interview. So we have to explicitly say that this code is bug-free and do not look for bugs. Otherwise, it's the only way to shake them from that assumption that we're trying to catch them in some sort of trap. So why do we ask our candidates to read our code? So we ask them to read our code because a lot of what they'll be doing, especially when they first get started, is reading our code. What does this code walkthrough actually tell us about our candidates? Well, first let me just describe what the strongest candidates are able to, or sort of look like to us, right? They're able to make connections between individual lines of code, our implementation detail, and the big picture of our business and user experience. They ask great questions that show they're interested in our domain, in our technical decisions, and in the stories of our users. They may not know why some of our variables have an @ symbol in front of them. They may be surprised to see methods that end with a question mark. But the most compelling candidates seem like genuinely excited about looking at code with us. They are the people who it's easy to imagine pairing with on day one on their first story. They communicate their thought process. And basically, like if you walk through code with someone for 20 minutes, I think you will actually have a pretty good idea if you would benefit from having them on your team. So we also grade this section on a curve. For candidates with less professional coding experience, we focus mostly on that first question: what is this code for? What does it do? Recent graduates of computer science programs, of coding schools, don't usually have a ton of experience reading other people's code. So this is already kind of a big ask. For candidates with more experience, we want them to be able to make that leap into here's what I like and dislike about the code. So after about 20 or 30 minutes, we stop the conversation and we ask the candidate to stop sharing their screen, which is a bit of like a psychological break. Again, Matz is nice, so we are nice. We try to give some positive feedback at this point by pointing out the strengths that the candidate exhibited throughout the conversation. And we're never just making this up. People tend to do pretty well in these types of conversations, and it allows them to show off their strengths. So then we move into the third portion of our interview. We ask the candidate to write some code for us. So we call this our code composition module. And we ask the candidate to write, the code that we ask the candidate to write requires them to take in some JSON and do something to it and output some JSON. So it's really similar to a lot of the work that we do on a daily basis. We start by showing a sample example output from what we want them to write so that they have the goal in mind. And then we move backwards to an example piece of source data. And we walk through the entire data structure together and explain in detail how to go from input to output. Yeah, we are literally giving them the answer to the question that we're asking them. Again, we have to remind the candidate that there's no trick and there's no gotcha, right? We say this is not a speed run. The answer is not interesting to us. We just gave it to you. The process that you take to put this into practice is what's interesting to us, and we actually mean that. And we encourage folks to use Google. We frame the question again as if this is the first story that they're taking on our team, and so they can just tap us if they have a question, just like they would on the first day of the job. So what does completing our coding challenge or our coding composition module tell us about the candidate? First, we get to see how a candidate plans. We get to see how they might code since they're using their own dev environment. We get to see whether or not they use test-driven development, what language they feel most comfortable with, and how systematically they can approach the problem. The best candidates make a plan and usually even write out their plan in comments or pseudocode. Then they begin implementing their plan, but they check themselves line by line. The folks who tend to not do as well either don't plan at all or just write a bunch of code all at once, which makes debugging way more challenging. We're also not shy to ask questions and point candidates in the right direction if they start going down the wrong path. And this type of interaction gives us data on the candidate's collaboration style. So after about 30 minutes of watching the candidate, we can pretty confidently say like if they know how to code, and also if they take a systematic approach to their development, and then also potentially like how collaborative and receptive to feedback they are. So after ending the code composition module, we leave around 10 minutes for the candidate to ask us questions. We say our goodbyes. Immediately after the interview, we use a rubric to score the candidate on several criteria that are important to us, like asking questions, like communication, technical proficiency. And these things are directly assessed by the exercises we just went through. So candidates who do well in this technical interview have passed the only technical hurdle in our interview process. We invite them to join us for one more interview with two parts. The first part is a culture add interview assessed by developers based on a discussion of the candidate's work experience. And then there's also a leadership interview performed by the hiring manager. So to summarize, the old interview was not nice. The new interview is trying to be nice. We want to collect data that allows us to make decisions about the potential of a candidate as quickly and accurately as possible. We do so by shortening the overall process and aligning each component with an assessment of a skill that we actually care about. I think that there's, of course, a lot of room for improvement in our process. For example, our code composition module tends to favor folks who are comfortable with Python, Ruby, JavaScript, and other languages where JSON is sort of like a first-class citizen. We have some starter files to help our Java friends get past the JSON parsing and onto the fun part, but that's definitely a weak point. Another problem is that we aren't completely consistent with how we carry out the interview in terms of how much support and guidance we give the candidate, right? A lot of this is by feel, so we tend to be a bit more handholdy with more junior candidates. But of course, there's likely a bit of unconscious bias at play here. And we can be better in that regard by watching each other, by practicing together and formalizing our process a bit more. It's still very new. I'd also like to see more salary transparency, especially when working with candidates from underrepresented groups. So I hope by now I have helped convince you that that there's some efficacy to this Minaswan interview. And I'd like to close out the talk with some tips and pointers on how to enlist support to that end. So first, most tech companies have been remote since March, and the transition from in-person to remote work helped accelerate our transition to a Minaswan interview. Sort of like gave like a natural point to reboot our process. So next, get HR on board. And the easiest way to do that is just to shorten the overall process. HR hates when candidates drop out of the process because they got an offer with another company or just don't want to persevere through a 20-step process. Third, get engineers involved, right? You can't do this alone. While I put together some of the questions at first, I quickly shared what I was doing with engineering managers, individual contributors, and these folks gave me awesome feedback. And in many cases, just started like writing PRs on the repo that we were putting together to hold the work. So we've been doing this Minaswan interview for a few months now. And so far, the results have been quite positive. And I can't say that we make perfect interviewing decisions as a result of this process. It's just too soon. I can say, I can point to other factors that let me know that we're on the right track. So first, engineers are actually like, I wouldn't say excited, but they're definitely more excited than they used to be to do these interviews. Also, HR is very excited about this process. So 2 key stakeholder groups are into it. And then finally, the candidates seem to actually be enjoying the process. And so I want to like close by sharing a piece of feedback that we got from a candidate. So I'll read this email that we got because I'm very proud of it. So this person said, I also wanted to provide some positive feedback in regards to the interview on Thursday. I understand you are currently in the process of transitioning from a take-home assignment to the live pairing style interview performed on Thursday. So I just wanted to say that the style of interview is potentially the best form of technical interview I've seen yet. I sometimes get frustrated with contrived leet code style interviews, but I really thought both pieces of the interview were simultaneously very practical and a great test of a candidate's knowledge and capability of picking up new concepts and languages. I hope that you feel the same and that other candidates feel similarly, as this is certainly where I'd love to see the industry move in terms of technical interviewing technique. I don't usually write on my reflections of the interview process, but I really wanted to give credit where credit is due. So all of this is to say, Matz is nice, and so we are nice. Thank you very much, RubyConf. This was a lot of fun. I will be in Slack to take questions immediately after this call if anybody has questions. But thank you so much. I'll see you all at the next one.